You can find them on bookshelves throughout the nation, bookstores with titles concerning loss, how to cope with loss. That's the subject of today's Austin Faith Dialogue, and by staying tuned with us, you will not be at a loss in your interest.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, welcoming you to this edition of the show. And today we're going to give our attention to the subject of loss. And it is true that there are a number of books on any of the bookstores that you might visit about necessary losses and living beyond loss. And it's something which is so much on our mind because it's so much of a need for each of us to learn how to cope with loss. And today we're privileged to have a couple of folks from the Austin therapeutic community to help us in understanding and in dealing with the matter of loss. Jeff, hi. We're glad to have you here. Jeff Sykes, you've been a psychologist in this community for a while, haven't you? Yes. And Hannah Laurie Hanson, I know that you haven't been here quite so long, but that as a body psychotherapist that you're working with folks who are suffering loss.
That's right, that's right.
And I think that I'd like to start with Judith Viorce's Necessary Loss, where she even organizes her book about losses throughout the life cycle, beginning with separation from mother. Could you pick up on that, Jeff?
You know, one of the most difficult struggles we have through our life is the tension between our desire for that oneness that we experienced as infants with our mother, and yet for us to mature, we have to separate from mother and from the desire to only be at one with people.
Okay.
And it's very difficult psychologically, as you can see in 16, 17, 18-month-old when they are pulling away and coming close and so forth. And as we grow older, we keep wanting, even in religion, of course, to get that feeling of oneness back, and yet we can't feel human and whole without also feeling separate and individual.
And as you go through life, I mean, people are suffering not only early on the separation from parents, but separation when they leave home and loss of work, and sometimes
and loved ones. When we have arguments, it's helping us create a feeling of separateness, and yet we long for the oneness, and it's all the way through. And then in older age, our kids go away, our parents die, friends die, our body decays,
and ultimately
we die.
We die. Have to.
I didn't even think of saying that.
Well, I think that coming to terms with our own mortality.
Yes.
As dealing with loss in a very personal way. Hannah Laurie, you want to add any of that?
I would like to say that in addition to the personal loss that we feel in our own person, there is a basic brokenness which expresses itself as fragmentation of body, mind, and spirit. So not only do we walk around fragmented, but also our environment, particularly in the Western tradition here in this country, there is a loss of security, a sense of loss of healthy, secure environment because of the global connection that we have.
Okay, so the loss of security is not just a matter of what any one of us personally is coping with,
right?
But for a nation and a society. I know you grew up in Germany,
right?
And I've heard you speak of a loss there of a nation.
Loss of a country. I watched my country die, and that is such an existential crisis that as a young child I have struggled to overcome. And so perhaps that sensitizes me more to the undertones in this country when we know of disasters immediately when they strike in foreign countries and here.
And I think that the fact that you're a body psychotherapist means that you're particularly attuned to the fact that in order to cope with loss and grief, it
Right.
has somehow to do with the body as well as the emotions and the spirit.
Exactly. The integration of body, mind, and spirit can only be experienced through the body, in my experience, that the ego gets affirmed, and then we need to jump across to the healing in the spiritual realm, and the body is the integrative piece.
Okay, I think we'll have occasion to come back to that when we talk about how you work with folks concretely. I'd like, before we go on, just to take a look at 2 or 3 of these titles that drew my attention to the subject. I mentioned Judith Viors's book, Necessary Losses, which probably is the best known one. There is an Episcopal priest who's written one called Living Beyond Your Loss, and there's another one, Bob Dietz, who also happens to be an ordained person, Life After Loss. And I think that each one of these authors is trying to help people recognize that that to be human is to lose. I think it was Dietz who was quoting Rabbi Harold Kushner, bad things happen to good people. And that's always been the case, and it happens throughout any given person's lifetime. My question to you two is this: is it worse today, or more complicated today, or has the modern world aggravated or exaggerated our losses?
I think things are more fragmented today. We don't have an extended family living around us. We don't have as much a sense of community. We don't have as much automatic ritual around loss and to help us feel it as a part of regular existence, and that we get through it and we grow from it. So it's much more difficult today, I think.
There's less community, less sense
Yes.
of support. in
Yes.
that. Okay? You feel that from your experience?
Yes, and in addition, for the last 75 or 100 years, psychology traditionally has separated itself from the spiritual entity, from the spiritual journey of a person. The reason that I came to Austin is because there are therapists like Jeff and his wife Sidner who embrace the wholeness, who know the healing can only happen on all levels, body, mind, and spirit.
I see. Okay, well, let's turn then to how you deal with folks, Jeff. You and your wife are practicing together,
Yes.
and people come to you, and as psychologists, I mean, you're not just giving them a battery of tests.
No, I never do that.
Tell me how you work with folks.
Well, the first thing, they come in and I say, tell me about your heartache. And everybody has heartache and has suffered. And the important thing in therapy is for them to really experience their feelings more deeply. We have all kinds of defenses against our feelings. And to help the unconscious work and digest the trauma in our lives. And personally, my preference is in group therapy. Ultimately, I think people do best in a group setting where they're hearing other people talk about their father's loss, and I may not have been able to get to my feelings on my own, and I hear somebody else grieving about their father's loss, and all of a sudden my feelings come up, and I can feel myself in relation to other people with a support, and it's very healing.
So that interaction makes a difference than if it's
Yes.
just one-on-one.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And in your work?
I find that most of my work is dealing with grieving issues. somehow in our human condition we seem to just go along fine until we experience a loss, and that forces us to grow in a very painful way. And I admire the folks who come into my office very courageously. And what I find is that we all walk around in this body, and the body never forgets. It remembers how we were held or not held as children. It also is a storehouse of unprocessed grief. And as I work with my patients, they access that.
Okay. As you work with your patients, it's hands-on.
It's hands-on.
How do your hands work with folks?
Gentle touch for whatever the person might be ready. We are a touchless society.
Ah,
And
there's a lot of skin hunger, in other words.
everyone who comes into me is touch hungry, whether they know it or not. And some are very frightened if there has been trauma in their background.
Yeah.
So I work with them fully clothed or skin to skin or whatever they can tolerate. I do craniosacral therapy, massage therapy, just gentle energy work.
Well, it seems to me, too, that the fact that people are out of touch in a literal way, as well as an emotional way, as you're talking about, and in a spiritual way. Hannah Laurie was saying that you're open to dealing with people on that level as well. And in the second half of the show, which we're coming to in a couple of minutes, we'll delve into that. But just at this point, you include a spiritual response in your work with people who are grieving?
Well, always in therapy, it's a love relationship. And in group, you will see people really loving each other very deeply. And that has a tremendous spiritual component as people feel a care and oneness with each other, and yet their separateness.
So love is how you define spirituality in this sense.
Yes.
It's an emotional thing, and yet...
It's more than just what's here with us.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's more to what we're going to talk about, but we're going to have to wait until we get to the second half. And I'd like to say that the whole thought of loss and grief are inseparable. And that good grief, Granger Westberg wrote a book called that has been used by many pastors. And that is on the presumption that grief is been given to us by God as a means of healing and of helping us move through loss and into new life. And the extent to which we can celebrate that and be grateful for that rather than to avoid it is what we'll come back to in the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue today. Stay with us. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today our subject is on losses, coping with loss. And we have two folks from the Austin therapeutic community, Jeff Sykes, who's a psychologist, and we also have Hannah Laurie Hansen, who is a body psychotherapist. And in the first half, we were more or less focusing upon the range of losses, that it's not just a matter of death, but throughout life. And that we also were talking about how people are needing to be approached holistically, not just in talking to them, but as being part of a community, bringing the body into play. Now I would like to talk about, in the second half, particularly the spirit. The fact that Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." And if we start with that premise that somehow grief is a positive value that's been given to us, then how does that come into play as you work with people? You talked about working in groups, Jeb, in the first half. Do you see the church as a resource for group therapy?
A wonderful resource. First, let me say, at church, you have permission to be your loving self. In our society, we have so many barriers. We're not supposed to look at each other. We're not supposed to ask each other about painful things. We're not supposed to ask someone about their mother who's dying. It seems like at church there's a permission for us to recognize each other in deeper ways. And at any Sunday school class or Bible study or prayer group, people have permission to really be concerned about each other deeply and to share of themselves with each other.
Okay. If a congregation is, and it can be a Jewish congregation as well as a Christian or some other faith group, as long as there is openness and honesty, acceptance, not passing judgment, that sort of thing.
Right.
And so if I want to tell you about my loss in a church setting, I ought to be free to be more personal than I am outside that setting.
Absolutely. It's been my experience that people are.
Okay. From your experience, Hannah Laurie, how does the faith community enter into it?
Well, first of all, I'm an associate of the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi in Milwaukee. And in our community, we have at least 10 sisters who pursue healing with touch. And as our model, there is Christ touching people to heal, touching and loving. And so there is, after all, Christ is the divine therapist, and he's given us a good model. And that is basic to the way I receive my patients and how I work with my patients, with total respect for the Christ that is within them.
Okay. Now, people come to you who are not particularly religious in their background, are not expecting to be involved in what they would see as a spiritual connection with you.
Right.
So you don't necessarily use the Christ terminology with them.
No, I very rarely use it unless it is brought to me specifically. I am aware that we all are unique and divine human beings in the sight of the one who is love. As you said, in the spiritual community we can be our loving self. And that's what people are healing from losses are really looking for, is to become whole in their loving self again.
You know, one of the other things I think people are looking for, and years that I spent in the pastorate, I came to the conclusion that somehow they don't want somebody there, ecclesiastically otherwise, to give them answers to questions that can't be answered. I know this book by Dietz says that you can tell people are on a healthy recovery mode when they're not asking so much, why did this happen? Why did I lose my wife or my job or lose my marriage or whatever? But how questions take the place of the why questions.
Right, right.
How do I now go on with my life in the face of this loss? How do I find resources that I can bring into play and so on? So to me, that was a very helpful kind of thing. And that was the sort of thing as people would talk to me, I'd say, it's kind of a problem-solving thing too, of how to cope.
Right.
But hope is essential to coping. And I know in our conversation, Jeff, before we went on the air, you were saying that as clients come to you, you like to be able to give them hope. And how do you do that? And how can you do that? What's the basis of your offering them that?
Well, as they're going through, as they are facing courageously very difficult feelings within them and total despair and wishes to be dead, I have faith in the process that as we're together, being honest in a caring relationship, that good things will happen, that there will be healing. And I have to carry the faith, or in group, that the group carries the faith.
Even when they feel hopeless, you say, until you can feel hope, I'll feel hope for you? Is that what
I
you
don't
mean?
say it, I just exude it.
I
hope.
see, I see. You're a hopeful person,
Yes.
which is essential to your therapy,
Yes.
okay? Are you hopeful, Hannah Laurie?
I'm hopeful, and also I'd like to say that I have often done sessions as co-therapy with a psychologist, because touching and opening is a process that happens, and there's a wonderful dance that happens then with the verbal and the inner self in the healing process.
No, I don't understand that. What do you mean by that?
I mean that the combination of verbal therapy, which the kind that Jeff does,
Okay,
and the body work
Ah.
together
okay.
help in the process. They accelerate the process of healing,
Uh-huh.
because there is, in a sense, that return to a secure father-mother relationship.
Oh, I see, as a team, in a sense. Mm-hmm. You know, there's this book by this Episcopal priest I was referring to earlier about living, I think it's Living Beyond Your Losses. And he talks about the dean of Episcopal Seminary who had lost his son and had to take time to basically go lick his wounds while he was recovering. And he came back to chapel, and he said to the seminarians, I'm back here to tell you that I've been to the bottom, and the good news is that it's solid. Now that conviction of there being hope, that there's something in reality that gives us that kind of hope. You're an Episcopalian, aren't you,
Yes.
Jeff? I think you confessed that to me once. Do you find your hope coming out of that kind of that conviction?
Yes, I might say that we probably are best at facilitating people going where we've been before.
Ah,
And if we've been to the bottom in some sense, and there are a lot of different bottoms, it's much easier, and we've come out of it and are more creative and more human and more full afterwards. It helps us know how to empathize with them when they're there, and so forth. And there've been things I haven't been able to get to. I've gone to Hannah Laura. She's that I couldn't get at verbally, and something special happened when she worked with me.
and the whole principle of the 12-step groups of AA and the others who, because they've been through this,
Yes.
they have an authority and experience that they can bring. That means that their hope is convincing from that standpoint. Now, Hannah Laurie, I think that the one thing that Jeff saying that there's some experiences that you've been able to reach people with. I know you've dealt with people who have been who suffered abuse,
Yes.
physical abuse,
Torture.
emotional abuse. Tell us about something of that.
Most of the people, unfortunately, that we see in a psychotherapy setting have survived trauma of some kind. And there is no one immune in our society anymore. I think it's the empathy that I can bring, having survived Nazi Germany and Russian occupation and Polish occupation, starvation, all of the country dying, chaos, and coming back from that, losing my faith totally, and coming back from that, I think I can look into the eyes of someone who comes to me and feel empathy and see them, so that they can feel, I have been seen, I have been heard.
Wow. I have to say that really is, gets us down into as deep as you can get, because you've had the experience of loss in a way that most folks are not aware of, and yet you're saying that people are more aware of it than we might recognize. And I think of sexual abuse in this country, how prevalent that is. And you talked about the body having memories.
Right.
It never forgets anything.
Right.
And how do you unlearn all of that except through somehow touching?
Touching, remembering,
Within
and
a context of love.
within the context of love and being safe, and restructuring, reintegrating the loss and the pain, and coming face to face with that loss, the total existential crisis. People often say to me, well, what you experience is so much more difficult. I beg to differ. I think when someone who loves us abuses us, who's supposed to love us, is so painful and annihilating, which is, in my estimation, more serious. I mean, you cannot equivalent grief or loss, but at least I wasn't abused by those who are to care for me.
Yeah. You didn't lose trust in your...
In those who, in my parents.
Yeah, okay. Well, guess what? We're within the last minute and we've just scarcely touched this subject.
Yes.
But I think that in closing, if in just a few seconds you wanted to say to someone who's watching, Jeff, what they can hope for, can you give them a word of hope?
Hope for understanding human suffering and being able to be part of humanity. And
Okay, and I think I would have to add, see, here's the minister in me coming out, the hymn of Isaac Watts, my richest gain I count but loss, and that in faith that we can take our losses as the occasion for gain and to the glory of God. And I'd like to touch you to thank you. And thank you folks for joining us. Be with us next week. I'm Rich Thompson, and peace be with you.